The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel buzzed with anticipation on that sunny Saturday morning. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across the cream-colored walls, while arrangements of fresh white roses and baby's breath perfumed the air. The wedding planners team scurried about, making final adjustments to the delicate place settings and silk chair sashes that transformed the already elegant space into something magical. David Anderson stood before the full-length mirror in the groom's suite, his experienced fingers working to perfect his body for the third time. At 42, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored black tuxedo. Success had been kind to him, etching only the slightest hints of silver at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a life well lived. As one of the city's most respected architects, he had designed countless beautiful spaces, but none seemed quite as significant as the one he would be married in today. In the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a vintage leather armchair, sat 10-year-old James. His small hands clutched his tablet computer so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The boy's reflection in the mirror caught David's attention. The child's usual bright energy seemed dimmed, replaced by an unusual stillness that might have worried him if he wasn't so caught up in pre-wedding excitement. "How's the tie looking, buddy?" David called over his shoulder, trying to include his son in the moment. James managed a weak smile but said nothing, his fingers tapping nervously against the tablet's screen protector. Outside the suite's door, the sound of excited chatter grew as more guests arrived. David could hear snippets of conversation about how stunning Rebecca White, his bride-to-be, looked in her designer gown. The dress had been a closely guarded secret, one that Rebecca had spent months selecting from exclusive boutiques. "Only the best for our perfect day," she had insisted, with that dazzling smile that had first caught his attention at a charity gala 2 years ago. The wedding planner, Ms. Chen, poked her head into the room. 20 minutes, Mr. Anderson," she announced with professional cheerfulness, her clipboard hugged close to her chest. "The string quartet is set up, and the photographer would like to get some pre-ceremony shots with you and James." David nodded, finally satisfied with his bounty. He turned to face his son fully, noticing how James seemed to shrink further into the armchair. "Come on, sport. Time for pictures." He crossed the room and held out his hand, but James didn't immediately take it, something that had never happened before. "Dad," James started, his voice barely above a whisper, but he was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was David's best man, Thomas, looking sharp in his matching tuxedo. "The guests are all seated, Dave. Rebecca's dad is practically bouncing with excitement out there." Thomas paused, picking up on the tension in the room. "Everything okay in here?" David looked between his friend and his son, momentarily catching an expression of what looked like desperation on James's face. But before he could inquire, Ms. Chen reappeared, this time more insistent. "Mr. Anderson, we really must stick to the schedule. The photographer is waiting." With a gentle tug, David guided James to his feet. The tablet remained clutched in the boy's hands like a lifeline as they walked toward the door. Neither father nor son noticed how the device's screen briefly lit up with a notification. "Video download complete. Meeting_Rebecca_business_plans for." 3 days before the wedding, the Anderson household had finally settled into silence after a chaotic evening of last-minute preparations. James lay in his bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on his ceiling that his father had helped him arrange into accurate constellations. Sleep refused to come, his mind racing with thoughts about how different life would be after the wedding. The digital clock on his nightstand blinked 11:42 p.m. when his throat felt parched. Deciding to get some water, James slipped out of bed, his astronaut-themed pajamas rustling softly as he padded down the hallway of their modernist home, one of his father's proud designs. The house was different at night, all sharp angles and shadows, but James knew every corner by heart. As he passed Rebecca's home office, an unfamiliar voice caught his attention. The door was slightly ajar, a thin slice of light spilling onto the hallway's hardwood floor. James knew he shouldn't eavesdrop. His father had taught him about privacy. But something in the tone of the conversation made him pause. Everything's proceeding exactly as planned. Rebecca's voice carried through the gap, unusually crisp and businesslike. Nothing like her warm, honey-sweet tone around his father. The merger documents are hidden within the prenuptial agreement. Once he signs the wedding certificate, the transfer of company ownership will be automatic. James's heart began to race. He remembered his tablet was in his pajama pocket. He'd been reading comics before bed. With trembling fingers, he opened the video recording app, carefully positioning himself to capture the conversation through the door's opening. "Don't worry about the kid," Rebecca continued, her chair creaking as she leaned back. "James is just a child. Besides, I've already suggested to David that boarding school would provide better opportunities. Once he's away, we can proceed with restructuring the firm without interference." The words hit James like a physical blow. Boarding school. His father had never mentioned anything about sending him away. They were a team. They even had matching drafting tables in the home studio, where James would do his homework while his father worked on designs. "The architecture firm is worth significantly more than the last two combined," Rebecca was saying, her manicured nails tapping against her desk. "Anderson Designs has contracts with major developers across 3 states. Once we modify the company structure, the liquidation value alone would set us up for years." James pressed the back of his hand against his mouth to stifle a gasp. He'd heard his father use terms like liquidation during business calls. It meant selling everything. Rebecca was planning to destroy what his father had spent 20 years building. The conversation continued, with Rebecca outlining more details of her scheme. James recorded everything, his young mind racing to understand the complex business terms she used. He caught phrases like shell company, asset transfer, and offshore accounts, words he'd heard on the business news his father watched every morning. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, Rebecca wrapped up her call. "This time next week, Anderson Designs will have new management, and our little architect won't know what hit him until it's too late." James waited until he heard her shut down her computer before silently retreating to his room, the water forgotten. His tablet felt heavy with the weight of its recorded evidence. In the darkness of his bedroom, he opened his web browser, hands shaking slightly as he typed, "How to research someone's business history." The clock read 12:17 a.m. The wedding was in 3 days, and James Anderson had just become the only person standing between his father's life's work and complete disaster. Sleep eluded James as he devoted the next 2 days to his investigation, turning his bedroom into a makeshift detective's office. His tablet became his most valuable tool, and thankfully, Rebecca never noticed that her home office Wi-Fi password was still stored in it from when she had let him use it for homework. Between wedding preparations and last-minute guest arrangements, no one questioned why he was spending so much time in his room. The first breakthrough came when James discovered Rebecca White wasn't her original name. Using the business terms he'd heard in her conversation, he found an article about a Rebecca Winters who had married the owner of a successful construction company in Seattle 3 years ago. The company had mysteriously dissolved 6 months after the wedding, its assets sold off to overseas buyers. Before that, she was Rebecca Walsh, married to a property developer in Boston. That company, too, had been systematically dismantled and sold within a year of their marriage. Each time, she had emerged with substantial profits while her former husbands were left with nothing but questions and empty bank accounts. James meticulously documented everything, creating a digital folder organized with the same precision his father used for his architectural projects. He named it Operation Save Dad, tucking it away in a hidden folder disguised as a video game. His hand shook as he added each new piece of evidence: newspaper clippings, business records, and court documents that painted a clear picture of Rebecca's pattern. During dinner that evening, Rebecca chatted enthusiastically about the wedding flowers while James watched her with new eyes. How had she managed to hide her true nature so completely? She'd even convinced his father to add her name to the company letterhead last week, just to make it official before the wedding. "James, honey, you've barely touched your pasta," Rebecca noticed, her voice dripping with concern that now sounded false to his ears. "Are you feeling nervous about your ring-bearer duties?" He forced himself to take a bite, managing a weak smile. "Just excited, I guess." The pasta tasted like cardboard in his mouth. His father reached over to ruffle his hair affectionately. "That's my boy. You know, Rebecca's idea about that boarding school in Switzerland might be perfect for you. They have an amazing young architects program." James nearly choked on his food. So it wasn't just talk. She was already putting the boarding school plan in motion. He excused himself early, claiming homework, and rushed back to his investigation. Late into the night, James found the most damning evidence yet. A private business forum contained a thread warning others about a woman who specialized in taking over architecture and construction firms through marriage. The description matched Rebecca perfectly, down to her signature approach of suggesting boarding schools to remove children from the picture. James saved everything to his tablet, then backed it up to his private cloud account, something he'd learned about in computer club. He knew he had to tell his father, but Rebecca had masterfully arranged the wedding schedule to keep them apart. Every time James tried to get a moment alone with his dad, she appeared with some urgent wedding detail that needed attention. As he lay in bed that night, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his young shoulders, James realized with growing dread that he was running out of time. The rehearsal dinner was tomorrow, and the wedding the day after. If he was going to save his father's company and their family, he would have to act during the ceremony itself. The thought made his stomach twist, but he remembered what his father always said. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak up when everyone else is staying quiet. The wedding ceremony reached its pinnacle moment at exactly 2:47 p.m. The string quartet's melody filled the Riverside Hotel's grand ballroom, and James stood at his designated spot near the altar, his small hands clutching both his tablet and the velvet ring pillow. His heart thundered so loudly in his chest that he was certain the guests in the front row must hear it. Rebecca looked picture-perfect in her designer gown, her practiced smile never wavering as she stood beside David at the ornate antique desk where the marriage certificate awaited their signatures. James had watched earlier through the ceremony as she'd smoothly swapped the original document with her modified version during the confusion of the Unity candle lighting. A sleight of hand so subtle that even the officiant hadn't noticed. "Before we proceed with the signing," the officiant announced, his voice carrying through the ballroom's perfect acoustics, "Mr. Anderson and Ms. White will read their personal vows to each other." James's fingers tightened around his tablet. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the brief window before the signing would begin. His father had just pulled out his handwritten vows, and for a split second, Rebecca's attention was fully focused on maintaining her adoring expression for the photographer. Time seemed to slow down as James took 2 steps forward. The weight of his discovery pressed against his chest like a physical force. He thought about all the times Rebecca had been so nice to him, buying him expensive gifts, taking him for ice cream. But then he remembered her cold voice in the office, planning to send him away and destroy everything his father had built. "Dad," James called out, his voice cracking slightly before finding its strength. "Please wait. There's something you need to see." The string quartet's music screeched to a halt. 250 heads turned toward him in unison. He heard his aunt gasp from somewhere in the third row. Rebecca's smile flickered for just a moment, so briefly that only James, who was watching for it, noticed. "James, honey," Rebecca started, her voice honey-sweet, but with an edge he'd never heard before. "The rings come later in the ceremony." But James was already moving. 2 weeks ago, he had helped the hotel's tech team set up the projection system for the wedding slideshow. He knew exactly which cables to connect, his fingers moving swiftly as he plugged his tablet into the system. His father hadn't moved, the handwritten vows still held loosely in his hands, a look of confusion crossing his features. "I'm sorry," "Dad," James said, his voice stronger now. "But you have to know the truth before you sign anything." He tapped his tablet screen, and the projector hummed to life. The massive screen behind the altar, which had been displaying elegant floral patterns, suddenly filled with Rebecca's own face from her late-night video call. Everything's proceeding exactly as planned. Rebecca's recorded voice filled the ballroom, crystal clear through the hotel's speaker system. "Once he signs the wedding certificate, the transfer of company ownership will be automatic." The color drained from Rebecca's face as her own words echoed through the space. She lunged forward, reaching for the tablet. But James had anticipated this. He stepped back, keeping the device out of her reach while ensuring the video continued to play. His father's expression transformed from confusion to shock as Rebecca's elaborate scheme unfolded on the screen before all their guests. The marriage certificate on the antique desk lay forgotten, its hidden clauses about business ownership now exposed before they could be signed into legal existence. The large projection screen became the focal point of the stunned ballroom as Rebecca's carefully constructed facade crumbled in high definition. James, his hands now steady with determination, navigated through his organized evidence folder. The first news article appeared, its headline stark against the white background. "Seattle Construction Empire Dissolves After Mysterious Asset Transfer." She wasn't Rebecca White then, James explained, his young voice carrying through the shocked silence. She was Rebecca Winters. He glanced at his father, whose face had gone pale beneath his summer tan. The article showed a slightly younger Rebecca, standing beside her previous husband at a charity gala, wearing the same calculating smile she perfected over years of practice. David took a step away from Rebecca, his eyes fixed on the screen as James brought up the next piece of evidence. Business records from Boston showed the systematic dismantling of another company under the name Rebecca Walsh. Bank statements revealed a pattern of transfers to offshore accounts, each occurring just before her previous marriages imploded. "It's all lies," Rebecca suddenly announced, her voice sharp with desperation. She turned to the gathered guests, arms spread in a gesture of innocence. "This is just a child's imagination running wild." "David, sweetheart, surely you don't believe." But James wasn't finished. He played another clip from the office recording. "The architecture firm is worth significantly more than the last two combined. Once we modify the company structure, the liquidation value alone would set us up for years." Rebecca's own voice betrayed her, the cold calculation in her tone a stark contrast to her current pleading expression. From the front row, David's sister Julia, a corporate lawyer, stood up and moved closer to examine the modified marriage certificate, still lying on the antique desk. Her eyes widened as she scanned the document. "David, these clauses, they would give her controlling interest in Anderson Designs the moment you signed. The company would be legally hers within 24 hours. The murmuring among the guests grew louder. Someone near the back shouted, "She did the same thing to my cousin's firm in Boston." Another voice added, "That's where the Walsh Industries fortune went." David finally found his voice. "The boarding school suggestions," he said quietly, looking at his son with new understanding. "You were trying to tell me at the rehearsal dinner, weren't you?" James nodded, scrolling to show the private business forum mornings about Rebecca's pattern. "She always suggests sending the kids away first. Then she takes over the company, sells everything, and disappears with the money." Rebecca's composed demeanor shattered completely. She lunged for James's tablet again, but this time David moved swiftly, placing himself between them. The wedding planner, Ms. Chin, who had been watching the scene unfold with professional poise, discreetly signaled to the hotel's security team. "The police might be interested in these documents," Julia announced, holding up the modified marriage certificate. "Attempting to fraudulently obtain company ownership through marriage under false pretenses is a serious offense." The evidence continued to play across the screen. More business records, more articles about mysteriously dissolved companies, more victims of Rebecca's elaborate schemes. Each new revelation caused another ripple of shock through the assembled guests. Some were already on their phones, presumably calling other potential victims to warn them. In the midst of the chaos, James felt his father's hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. When he looked up, he saw something in his dad's eyes that made all the sleepless nights of investigation worth it. Pride, mixed with profound gratitude. And most importantly, love. David Anderson stood motionless in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his mind racing to process everything he'd just witnessed. The elegant ballroom, decorated with such care for what should have been the happiest day of his life, now felt like the set of a suspense movie. Every interaction with Rebecca over the past 2 years played through his memory, taking on new meaning with the context of her deception. He remembered how she'd casually asked to see his business contracts, claiming she wanted to understand his work better. The nights she'd spent in her home office, supposedly planning their honeymoon, now revealed as sessions orchestrating his company's eventual downfall. Even her interest in his architectural designs had been a calculated move to learn the true value of his life's work. "The architectural plans in your office," David said quietly, turning to face Rebecca. "You weren't admiring them. You were assessing them for liquidation value." His voice carried in the hushed ballroom, where guests remained frozen in their seats, watching the scene unfold. Rebecca's perfectly made-up face tightened, her mask of innocence finally dropping completely. "You have no idea how much work it takes to research the perfect target," she said, her voice cold and unfamiliar. "Do you know how many architects I investigated before finding one with the right combination of assets and vulnerability? A widower with a young son, successful but lonely, eager to believe in love again." Her words struck David like physical blows, but they also awakened something in him. A fierce protective instinct, not for himself, but for his son. James had seen through her facade when he couldn't. His 10-year-old boy had been brave enough to stand up and expose the truth, risking everything to protect their family and their future. "The boarding school brochures," David continued, pieces falling into place. "Those weren't about James's education at all, were they?" Rebecca's laugh was sharp and hollow. "Children are always the biggest obstacle. They notice things adults overlook. They ask inconvenient questions. Sending them away is simply good business practice." She glanced at James with undisguised contempt, although this one proved more troublesome than most. David felt his hands clench into fists. Every paternal instinct screamed at him to protect his son from this woman who had so callously plotted to separate them. He turned to James, who still stood bravely by the projector, tablet in hand. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner, buddy. You tried to tell me, didn't you? All those times you wanted to talk this week." James nodded, his eyes glistening. "I tried, Dad, but she always interrupted, always had something urgent about the wedding that needed your attention." A necessity, Rebecca interjected, straightening her designer gown with practiced elegance. "Children can be surprisingly observant. I couldn't risk him warning you before everything was in place." Her eyes darted toward the exit, calculating. David noticed her slight movement and stepped closer to James. Julia, still holding the fraudulent marriage certificate, moved to block one exit while the hotel security quietly covered the others. The wedding planner, Ms. Chen, was already on her phone, speaking in hushed tones about a situation requiring immediate attention. "You know," David said, his architect's mind assembling the full picture of her deception, "we should really review all the documents you've had me sign over the past few months. Every contract, every agreement, every business decision you've influenced." He turned to his sister, "Julia, as my lawyer, I believe we have some work to do." The Riverside Hotel's grand ballroom had transformed from a wedding venue into what felt like a scene from a crime drama. David stood with his phone in hand, his fingers hovering over the keypad as Rebecca's words echoed in his mind. The weight of what could have happened, the near loss of his company, his home, and most importantly, his relationship with James, made his hand tremble slightly as he dialed 911. "Yes, I need to report an attempted fraud." He spoke clearly into the phone, watching as Rebecca's expression shifted from calculated charm to cold fury. We have documented evidence of multiple instances of corporate fraud and identity theft. The suspect is currently at the Riverside Hotel, Grand Ballroom. Rebecca's eyes darted between the exits like a trapped animal, but the hotel's security team had positioned themselves strategically. Among the wedding guests, 2 off-duty police officers who were friends of David's family had already moved to assist, their training evident in their calm, professional approach to the situation. James, still holding his tablet, began forwarding all his collected evidence to his Aunt Julia's email. "I have everything backed up in 3 different places," he announced, showing a maturity far beyond his years. "And the video is still recording." He gestured to his tablet, which was indeed capturing every moment of Rebecca's unraveling. The wedding guests, who had been frozen in shocked silence, now buzzed with activity. Several had recognized Rebecca from other business circles and were making their own calls. A man in the back stood up, phone in hand. "I'm on with the Seattle Police Department," he called out. They'd been looking for Rebecca Winters in connection with the Collins construction collapse. Rebecca's composure finally cracked completely. "None of you understand what it takes to survive in this world," she snapped, her voice harsh and unfamiliar. "Every one of you would do the same if you had the chance. Those men I married, they were weak. They didn't deserve their success." "And that's all on video too," James said quietly, his tablet still recording. A small smile of satisfaction crossed his face as he caught Rebecca's furious glare. The first police sirens could be heard in the distance. David took a step closer to his son, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. The touch seemed to break something inside him, and his professional demeanor cracked slightly. "I almost sent you away," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "To that boarding school. I almost." "It's okay, Dad," James replied, leaning into his father's side. "You didn't know, but I knew you'd believe me if I could just show you the truth." The ballroom doors opened as the first police officers arrived, led by the hotel's security team. Ms. Chen, ever the professional, had somehow produced a detailed timeline of Rebecca's activities at the hotel, including security camera footage of her switching the marriage certificates. Julia approached the officers, legal training taking over. "We have extensive documentation of an attempted fraud scheme," she began, laying out the modified marriage certificate and other evidence, including video confession, financial records, and documented patterns of similar crimes in other states. As the officers began taking statements, David pulled James into a proper hug, not caring about the tears that threatened to stain his tuxedo. "You saved more than just our company today, buddy," he whispered. "You saved our family." The setting sun streamed through the ballroom's grand windows, casting long shadows across the space where 2 lives were meant to be joined. 2 months after the wedding that wasn't, the Anderson home buzzed with a different kind of energy. The modern architectural marvel that David had designed now featured a newly renovated space, a shared studio where 2 drafting tables stood side by side, one sized perfectly for a 10-year-old aspiring architect. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm patterns across father and son as they worked on their respective projects. James sat at his drafting table, carefully working on his design for the school's architecture club competition. His tablet, the same one that had saved his father's company, now displayed architectural software